to move in on Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein. It was a smaller scale than, say, Desert Storm or the future Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was tailor-made for a coup, to back a coup that never happened because Saddam's regime was able to detect it and deter it. I'm thinking that when we speak of Venezuela, the United States would be looking to carry out a similar action, very concerted military action to suppress the security regime around Maduro so that a coup could take place to replace him. That seems to be the most likely scenario at this juncture. There's a couple problems with this, though. Donald Trump ran on a platform of peace. His voters are holding him to this issue. The American people do not want war. And we definitely don't want a war with a neighboring country that could generate a massive migration crisis where refugees now in a country whose society has collapsed, whose economy has collapsed, are now fleeing the country. And where are they going to go? North to the United States. We have an immigration crisis. We don't need to be fueling it with a war that we don't need to fight. Two, we have a history of being able to remove regimes from power. We're very good at killing people. I mean, ask Gaddafi, ask Saddam. We're good at removing people, ask Assad. But we're not good at is finishing the job. And Donald Trump ran on a platform that said, we need to stop getting ourselves involved in failed military adventures that take decades and consume trillions of dollars. And yet he's preparing to do just that in Venezuela. There was a shock in the polls a week or so ago when we saw the Republicans lose across the board. They lost in Virginia, they lost in New Jersey, they lost New York City to a radical, communist even. This sent a shot across the bow of Donald Trump. He has important midterm elections coming up, and he has to ensure that he doesn't lose his political base. He has economic difficulties. He doesn't need to compound those by getting us involved in the very kind of war that he promised the American people we would never get involved in again.
So it seems like there's two main options, right? There's either this is gunboat diplomacy meant to intimidate Maduro and force him to make significant concessions, or if that doesn't work out, basically try to carry out a decapitation strike that sets the stage for regime change.
Yeah, and unfortunately, given the recent history of the United States, it might be that our efforts at diplomacy are just subterfuge. Look what happened with Iran. We told the Iranians we're ready to engage in detailed talks about their nuclear program. We even scheduled a date when we would have these meetings. And yet, 2 days before the meetings, the United States assisted Israel in carrying out a decapitation strike against the Iranian regime. We have openly bragged about the role, Donald Trump has bragged about the role we played in decapitating Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah. So we have a history of saying we want diplomacy, and then we betray the very concept of diplomacy through perfidy. I mean, it's a war crime. Perfidy is a war crime. When you bring out the white flag and say you want a truce, and the enemy comes out to talk to you and you kill the enemy, that's a crime of perfidy. And that's what we did against Hezbollah. That's what we've done against Iran. And I think that's probably what we'll do against Maduro. Maduro should be very careful when Donald Trump says, I want to have talks with you. Because what he's probably doing is setting Maduro up to let his guard down, and then we'll kill him.
So, you compared you said that Venezuela would be an even worse idea than going into Iraq. Let me play devil's advocate. Let me put on my neocon cap, right?
Good Lord.
Yeah. So if I were a neocon and I were looking at this, I would say look, it doesn't have to be like Iraq, because you can, for example, look at what happened in Grenada or Panama in the 1980s, where basically the United States went in, kicked ass, and left without so much as a scratch on it. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that, look, Venezuela could very well be similar because, Maduro and the current government is reportedly unpopular. There's a viable opposition in place in the form of the lady who won the Nobel Prize. If she, for whatever reason, declines, we could always cargo lift Juan Guaido out of Miami, airdrop him. But this isn't a sort of situation where, like Iraq, where Saddam Hussein, you get rid of him and just everything collapses. I guess, why is Venezuela a fundamentally different and more dangerous proposition than, let's say, Grenada or Panama?
Well, first of all, Grenada was an extraordinarily small island. If the United States of America can't steamroll an island with a minuscule army, with a handful of Cuban military engineers trying to build an airfield, then what? And it didn't go very well for us. We lost a lot of guys for stupidity. Navy SEALs were swept away by the ocean. Delta Force launched a number of attacks that were failures. The Army attacks stalled. After the paratroopers landed. The only people that actually performed well were the Marines. But even then, we lost a helicopter getting shot down by a nation that was really not equipped to face a superpower. I don't think we should be using Grenada as a symbol of American military strength and prowess. Panama. Well, geez, we occupied Panama. We had a military contingent already in place in Panama. It's not like we had to actually invade Panama. We just had to move off our base. We controlled Panama. The CIA had been actively involved in Panama, undermining the regime of Manuel Noriega. And again, things went very bad. Look at the SEAL attack on Noriega's private airplane and how many SEALs we lost. Delta Force's effort to rescue, a CIA agent that it was being held. We lost a helicopter, a number of people were wounded, and we ended up massacring a lot of Panamanians. It was a very bloody affair to topple a man that we propped up for so many years. He was an ally. I wouldn't call Panama the shining example of American military prowess. We don't have a military contingent in Venezuela. The CIA has been trying and failing for decades to overthrow either Chavez or Maduro. The Venezuelan military is very capable. It has the support of Russia. It has the support of Cuba, Nicaragua, China. The idea that this is going to be a walk in the park is absurd. And I would be careful about thinking that Maduro is unpopular. We have a tendency in the West to exaggerate the capabilities of the opposition. This lady who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who's one of the greatest warmongers ever, promoting the actual destruction of her country, how does that qualify you for a peace prize? I don't know. She's not popular. She's not going to be a popular leader. She will always be seen as a tool of the imperial West, as a tool of the CIA, as a tool of the United States. And if we do remove Maduro and put her in place, all we guarantee is popular unrest for decades. And as I said, the United States is very good at removing people from power. We're not very good at winning the game. Venezuela is a game we will not win. And the irony is, why are we going after them? We know it's not about drugs. Jim Story, the State Department official who was the former number 2 at the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, who then went to Colombia when the embassy left and set up the Venezuelan, embassy in exile, so to speak. He ran the covert operations. He organized repeated coup attempts against Maduro in the first Trump administration. He recently has come out and said that this hyping about the drugs, about Maduro's link to narco trafficking, et cetera, is just pure fiction. Pure fiction. Maduro's not doing that. This is about oil. This is about resources. And, look, however this plays out, drugs in Venezuela are going to become like weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Just a lie being used to justify a war. But we don't need to go to war if it's about resources. Maduro today is willing to allow the United States into Venezuela and manage Venezuela's oil production to the benefit of both Venezuela and the United States exclusively. So this is not so much about resources even, because we could get in, because this is about pride. This is Marco Rubio's war. Marco Rubio, when he was elected to the Senate, was, an anti-communist Cuban American who immediately turned his eyes on Venezuela, and in 2016 started articulating, when he got his seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee responsible for the Western Hemisphere, started to articulate the absolute need to militarize this, for the American military to get involved. And for nearly a decade now, he's been advocating for this. Now he's the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor combined in one. Unprecedented power, not seen since Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. And this is Marco Rubio's war. He's the one pushing this because he sees this conflict as his gateway to the presidency. Marco Rubio is not satisfied with being the Secretary of State. He's already run for president against Donald Trump. He hates Donald Trump. Just go back and look at the rhetoric from the campaigns. He despises Donald Trump. He was bought and paid for by Miriam Adelson, who gave Donald Trump $100 million to put Marco Rubio into the government. And Marco Rubio today is seeking to use the Venezuela conflict as the way to leap over J.D. Vance to become the next president of the United States.
And interestingly enough, there have been some leaks recently that apparently a group of neocon senators, donors, were lobbying specifically Trump to pick Marco Rubio as VP over J.D. Vance.
But Donald Trump hates Marco Rubio. Remember, little Marco. They don't like each other. They don't respect each other.
Then why is he Secretary of State and National Security Advisor?
Because Miriam Adelson gave Donald Trump $100 million.
Fair enough. You said something that I think is going to draw a lot of attention, and I know this because I've gotten flack for saying the same thing, but only, in a softer way. You said that the Venezuelan military is quite capable and that they're not going to be just steamrolled. Now, when you look at a lot of the discourse, people seem to think that the Venezuelan military is something akin to Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard that fled at first sight, or the Syrian Arab Army that last year also fled upon first contact. That basically, if you send in some B-52 bombers and you hit some sensitive targets, the whole thing will just come crashing down. But even if it doesn't come crashing down, the United States is so much technologically superior to whatever Venezuela has that the Venezuelan military won't be able to do a single thing to stop the U.S. Is that a fair assessment? Why or why not?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to push back on the concept of the Iraqi Republican Guard running at first sight. I fought in a war against them. They didn't run. They fought. They died. But these are some of the bravest soldiers I ever saw in combat. They were facing a technologically superior enemy who had air supremacy, and they stood their ground. They sought to engage. Ask the people that fought in the Battle of, I think it was 173 Easting against the Tawakana Division. They didn't run. They kept coming. They kept coming. They kept coming. They're not cowards. They were very brave. They stood their ground. They fought. The Medina Division fought. The Tawakana fought. The Hammurabi fought. And this is in the Gulf War. In the 2003 war, they likewise fought. They didn't run. There was no running in these people. They died in place, fighting a technologically superior enemy. It's wide open desert, which gave air power a lot of opportunities. Look at the map of Venezuela. How much desert is in Venezuela? Not too much. Probably none. A lot of jungle. You know who else fought us in the jungle? The Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese. Go back and read the histories of the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong didn't run. The North Vietnamese didn't run. They stood and they fought. And it cost us a lot to dig them out, and we ultimately lost that war, even though we had B-52 bombers pounding the hell out of that country. F-100 fighters coming in, dropping napalm. F-4 bombers coming in, dropping 250, 500-pound bombs. We didn't win. So anybody who thinks that we're going to steamroll the Venezuelans probably don't know anything about Venezuela. There's a lot of national pride there. And their soldiers are very professional. They train very hard, and they are very loyal, not just to Maduro and the government, but to Venezuela. They love their country. And when the gringo decides to come in, they're not going to just stand aside and say, welcome. They're going to fight. Maybe they'll die, but they're not going to run. They're going to stand and fight. And it's going to be young Marines that once again have to close with and destroy the enemy through firepower maneuver, who are going to be absorbing the bullets in their body as they have to do a job that should never be asked of them, to invade a sovereign nation, to wage war against a sovereign people.
But, to kind of dig deeper on the air supremacy point, why can't the U.S. just send in B-52 bombers, severely wound Venezuela and call it victory? Why isn't it just sufficient to overwhelm Venezuela with U.S. air power?
Air power just blows things up. I mean, ask the Taliban. B-52s, B-1s were flying over Afghanistan, no air defense. Anytime the Taliban's heads snuck up out of the desert, bam, 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 they got bombed, they were slaughtered, they were killed. Who controls Afghanistan today? The B-52 or the Taliban? Okay, this air power doesn't win anything. Air power kills people, it destroys things. Boots on the ground is what wins a war. And when you're fighting an enemy who's defending their territory, defending their land, defending their culture, defending their history, defending their legacy, defending their families, you got to go in and you got to root them out. And at the end of the day, they are more willing to die to defend their country than we are to die taking their country. And ultimately what happens in the United States, although we may win every tactical engagement, I'm going to tell you right now, nobody's going to beat a Marine Corps Rifle Company. All right? When the Marine Corps Rifle Company closes with the enemy, we will destroy the enemy. But then we're left with ground with dead bodies. The enemy disappears further into the jungle. We've lost some Marines. We regroup and we pursue. We engage them again. We kill them because we're better. We're better trained. We're the elite, but we lost more Marines. They flee deeper into the jungle. And we keep going. It's an endless, endless struggle. And behind us, the enemy filters back in. And we have to fight for that terrain all over again. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what would happen in Venezuela. Yeah, we'll win every tactical engagement. The B-52s will kill a lot of people, blow up a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, it'll be the Venezuelan people, their military, their militia that'll be holding the ground.
Yeah, and I mean, to kind of elaborate on that point, based on the reports that we're seeing, the United States is deploying around 10,000 troops near Venezuela, about 2,000 of which are U.S. Marines. That obviously isn't enough to occupy a country like Venezuela. But what sort of specific military objectives could such a force realistically accomplish?
Well, first of all, of that 10,000, the vast majority of them are sailors on ships. So they're not leaving their ships. They're staying on the ships to do that. The ships, though, have significant strike capacity, Tomahawk missiles. The aircraft carrier, Gerald Ford, obviously has an embarked air wing. And then we have other military assets, F-35 fighters that are deployed to Puerto Rico. And I guess now we're talking about further deploying in the region into Trinidad and Tobago. We can carry out a handful of precision strikes, similar to what we did in Iraq in 1998, Operation Desert Fox. We can fire hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cruise missiles into buildings that will probably be empty. We can drop bombs on targets that may be there, may not be there by the time we drop the bombs on them. But even if we blow up those targets, the Venezuelans have more equipment than we have bombs. What we can do is try to create instability, to try and destabilize the Maduro regime, to strike headquarters, to strike communications. The Marines can do limited incursions. We can seize a building. We can seize an airfield. We can seize a port. We won't be able to hold it too long because 2,000 Marines, it doesn't matter how good they are, there's just 2,000 of them. You'd have to have follow-on forces coming in. But what we could do is start something that then maybe the CIA has a plan for a coup, having the Venezuelan military change sides and fight on behalf of this Nobel Peace Prizing, a warmongering woman. But history has shown that that's not it. We expected Iraqi divisions south of Baghdad in Operation Desert Fox to leave their barracks and move to Baghdad after we bombed Saddam's Special Republican Guard. But they didn't. The generals who the CIA thought were going to do this said, no, we're Iraqi patriots. We're not playing this game. The generals that said, we'll play that game were arrested and murdered or executed by Saddam Hussein's people. That's the fate of any Venezuelan who thinks they're going to betray Venezuela today. Venezuela is a patriotic country. There is no room for traitors.
Beyond Venezuela, what broader consequences of a U.S. attack / U.S. invasion of Venezuela, what would be the broader consequences for the U.S. relations with the rest of Latin America?
Well, first of all, Colombia today is on the side of Venezuela. So this war could rapidly turn into a war between Colombia, Venezuela, and the United States. Cuba is supporting Venezuela. And if the United States gets bogged down in Venezuela, Cuba could become an important factor. Nicaragua, likewise, is supporting Venezuela. Brazil, this could lead to instability in Brazil. This could lead to instability in Guyana. It could lead to instability throughout the southern hemisphere, South America, Central America. I don't think Americans realize that we have lost our status of being the good guys. I mean, we maybe never were the good guys when it comes to South America. We were always the imperialists. I mean, we have a bad track record. Pinochet, Allende. We kill populist leaders. We promote dictators. But we've always had the overwhelming economic influence that translates into diplomatic pressure that can be applied. Today, you have BRICS. Brazil is a member of BRICS, which is an alternative multilateral approach to global economic relations. Argentina was invited, but they have a unique president who opted out. But that doesn't mean that the Argentinian people aren't looking for multilateral opportunities, especially today when we see the Argentinian economy collapsing because of the extremist policies of Milei. Chile, likewise, can see economic pressures. You go to Peru, you go to Ecuador, all of these nations have lingering resentment towards imperial America. And what we could be doing is igniting a firestorm of anti-American posturing in South America that then translates into Central America. I mean, Mexico's not our biggest fan. We're talking about waging war against the cartels in Mexico, which is a violation of Mexican sovereignty. We insult their president on a daily basis, and we undermine their economy. We could see Mexico turn from being a friendly neighbor into being a hostile neighbor, which create even more border insecurity. So this could go very bad, not just about making Venezuela the next Vietnam or the next Afghanistan, but making the entire region shift from being, the foundation of a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, which is what the Trump administration is pursuing today. We talk about Fortress America, where we're going to retreat from the Middle East, from the Pacific, from Europe, and build this Fortress America. But it's not much of a fortress if South America and Central America are rising up against the American hegemon. So this could go very bad, very fast.
And on that chaotic note, let's shift to Russia-Ukraine.
An easier problem.
Yeah, an easier nut to crack, yeah. Right now, the main news, obviously, is the crumbling of Ukrainian defenses around Pokrovsk and Mirnograd in the Donetsk region, and the crumbling of their defenses near Kupiansk in the Kharkov region. Now, the big debate online is, to what extent is this actually a big deal? So I'd be interested in hearing what your assessment is and what you think comes next after this.
I hesitate to put too much emphasis on a single battle. If you recall Bakhmut, the Battle of Bakhmut, that was the end all. That was the battle that the meat grinder at Bakhmut, grinding everybody down. Russia won, a great loss. Ukraine lost. They lost everything. 60,000 strong reserves were thrown away in Bakhmut. But after the battle ended, the line stabilized. And there hasn't been tremendous surge forward at that time because Ukraine had, people tend to forget this, from 2015 until the special military operation began in 2022, Ukraine had turned this area of Donetsk, of the Donbass, into a fortified heartland. I'm talking about defenses in depth.
Even more so than, let's say, what Hamas did in Gaza.
100% or more than what Hezbollah did in southern Lebanon. What Ukraine did in building these defenses is make this impregnable foundation of military power that they planned on using as a launching pad to complete the reconquest of Donbass, to throw out the pro-Russian separatists, et cetera. That's what triggered the war. A lot of people don't remember how in the weeks leading up to the special military operation, how Ukraine poured 60,000 troops into the region. They began intensive artillery bombardments, and they had a plan to initiate an offensive to drive out the separatists in March of 2022. The Russians carried out a preemptive strike, which is legal under the principles of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, preemptive self-defense. Russia, of course, engaged in a collective security arrangement with the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, which has a precedent in this action. It was, after all, the United States and NATO that created a collective security arrangement to justify their invasion and occupation of Kosovo. So what's good for the goose, should be good for the gander. But the point is, Pokrovsk was the logistical and command and control hub for this defense, especially in this sector of Donetsk. Behind Pokrovsk, there's nothing. Pokrovsk is the final, bolt that held that fortress area together. If Pokrovsk falls, and it is falling, there's almost a straight shot to the Dnieper River with nothing but flat farmland. Yes, that's ideal for drone warfare, but there is no Pokrovsk left to launch the drones from. I'm not saying that it's going to make it easy. The Russians aren't just going to go in. Russia's waging a war of attrition, and that's what people need to understand. This isn't about territorial advancement, big red arrows. It's about killing Ukrainians, straight up. This is about depleting Ukraine's manpower. And Russia's doing this in spades. On Russia's worst day, the casualty ratios are 1 to 3, meaning for every dead Russian, there's 3 dead Ukrainians. On Russia's best day, the casualty ratios are 1 to 12, 1 to 20, or even more because of the domination that Russia has on the battlefield. Russia's job isn't to give Ukrainians the opportunity to kill Russian soldiers. Russia's job is to kill the Ukrainians, to deplete their manpower, to make it impossible for Ukraine to sustain cohesive defense on a 1,000-kilometer front line. And Russia's succeeding in this. Everybody says, well, then when will the Ukrainians collapse? And the answer is when they run out of manpower. As long as Ukraine and NATO are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, this could be a while yet.
Again, let me put on my devil's advocate cap.
Your Ben Hodges cap.
Imagine I'm, a highly respected former U.S. general like Ben Hodges or Philip Breedlove, someone who gives expert commentary on CNN, MSNBC, other highly respectable news outlets. And they've looked at this war of attrition strategy, and they've looked at the Russian advances, and they say, they look pretty lackluster. The reason Russians aren't making big gains is not because they're playing four-dimensional chess, but because the Ukrainians have such robust defenses. Even though they have shortages of manpower, they've created this super impressive drone wall that helps close the gap. And that at this rate, it'll take, Russia 100 years to reach Kiev at the current pace that they're going. What sort of flaw do you find with that logic? What flaw do you see with that argument? Why isn't it a legitimate critique?
Well, I'll give them full credit. Look, let's never once denigrate the fighting capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. You won't find a single Russian who fights them that says, oh, they're horrible, they're weak, they can't fight. The Ukrainians are putting up a hell of a fight. There's no doubt about that. Drones, I just had a dinner with a Russian drone commander on the front line, and I asked him the question, who's better at drone warfare, Russia or Ukraine? He said, right now, Ukraine. They're very good at what they do. The problem is sustainability. Again, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. It's about sustainability. The Ukrainians are able, and they've shown this capability, to surge a tremendous amount of drone capability, the drone wall, you call it, into a specific region. And it's hell on earth for the Russian soldiers that are involved in that. You've seen the videos where they're using up to 5 drones for one Russian soldier to hunt them down and kill them. It's a bad day for the Russians when that happens. But then Russia is able to stabilize the front, bring in its own capabilities, and they start to attack not just the drones, but the people operating the drones. The most dangerous job in the war today for the Ukrainians is to be a frontline drone operator, because eventually the Russians will find you and they will kill you. And then when they kill you, you're no longer flying your drones, the drone wall collapses, and Russia surges its capability back in place and begins the very difficult job of digging the Ukrainians out of the ground. This is a very, very hard war. But the flaw there is that the Hodges and company, Breedlove, is they're looking at a map and they're measuring the gains. And they say, Russia's only advanced just this much. At this continued rate of advance, it'll take Russia forever to achieve its objectives. What they're failing to realize is that the advances are measured not in terrain captured, but Ukrainians killed. The Ukrainians cannot replace the casualties that they've lost. And so what will happen is eventually the Ukrainians will lose the ability to sustain cohesive defense on the front line, and then the real collapse will begin. At that point in time, Hodges and Breedlove will have to look at the map and acknowledge the error of their ways, because you will see rapid Russian advances at that time when the Ukrainians are no longer able to retain defensive cohesion. But while they can retain defensive cohesion, what does that mean, defensive cohesion? It means the Ukrainians have command and control, they have logistics, they have fire support, they have artillery that's able to fire on the Russians, they have drones, they have air power, they still are able to, Ukraine has all the tools available to it. And despite the fact of all the tools available to it, to include hundreds of billions of dollars of NATO's best equipment, the Russians continue to advance. That's one thing that Hodges and Breedlove tend to forget, is that no matter what we do with Ukraine, they're losing. And it's not just that they're losing territory, strategic objectives. This army that NATO has built is being destroyed. Ukraine has shown an ability to reinforce, to recruit new members, but the training becomes very poor. There's such a need for manpower that they're literally pulling people off the streets, giving them a week or so of training, throwing them to the front line where they either get killed, they get wounded, or they get captured, or they surrender. It's buying time. Eventually, they're going to run out of these resources. The best Ukrainian units right now are trapped in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. The 25th Brigade, they're all going to die. The 38th Marine Brigade, their history. Azov is supposedly in trouble in Kupiansk. I don't think any of them are going to be captured by the Russians, and they're not going to get out. So when these people die, these are the best of the best. These are the best fighters Ukraine has. There's no good fighters left to replace them. These are irreplaceable losses. And so what you'll have is poorly trained territorial brigades who will be used to plug the line, but they lack the skill set necessary to survive in modern combat, and they'll be slaughtered. And at some point in time, there just won't be any Ukrainians left to fight the war. Russia, meanwhile, is able to recruit more than enough manpower to replace combat losses, but more importantly, that allows them to accrue reserve strength. So Russia has a lot of flexibility. They can rotate their units in and out of combat more effectively, so the troops that are fighting are fresh, trained, motivated. The Ukrainians, once they get to the front line, they can't do the rotation. So these troops are online in contact for a very